Hi, my name's Jacqueline Purcell and I'm the Division B Governor, and my role today is to give you some top tips on how to be the best Sergeant at Arms that you can possibly be. You see, your role is to keep good order in the meetings, to look after the club equipment, and generally to make sure that everything in a meeting runs as smoothly as possible. And what this means is that you absolutely have to get to the meeting at least half an hour before anyone else. And here's one of my top tips. Make sure that any guests are also told to come to the meeting at least half an hour beforehand. And what happens then is that the guests arrive, there's hardly anyone there except you. You can quietly and efficiently get their names into the guest book, and then you can ask them things like, why have you come and what do you want to learn about public speaking? And even better still, you can get them to help you lay out the room and put some programs on chairs and put out the banner. People like to do things to help, and especially for a newcomer, it's always nice to be distracted by activity. And what this means is that by the time the rabble arrive and you're now being called every which way, you've already settled the guests and made sure that they're comfortable. You might also have a book handy to show the guests so that they can see what we do and how we do it. And these are the ways that the Sergeant at Arms can directly impact on membership growth. The second thing that you need to do is to position yourself at the door. And why do I say this? I say this because latecomers can be incredibly disruptive to a meeting. And so what I do is on the back row I put reserved stickers on all the chairs, and I make sure that anyone who comes late is ushered in quietly and efficiently without disrupting things. So that's another top tip. The other thing is that you need to study the agenda very carefully. And what I mean by this is people may need sticky stuff, they may need pens, paper, they may need a PowerPoint presentation shown, and the Sergeant at Arms role requires that you set all that up so that the meeting runs smoothly and people are able to deliver in an excellent fashion. So make sure that you study the agenda very carefully to see what may be required for you and plan ahead. Your role essentially is to be the host, and that means that setting the temperature in the room is your responsibility. Is it hot, cold, too hot, too cold? Do you need a fan on these warm nights? Make sure that you set that so that it's pleasing to most guests, and you can even ask guests, is the room okay for you? It's important that people feel comfortable because they're going to be there for 2.5 hours. Now we also have some water for the commercial break, and we always say to people the champagne is in the corner of the room, and it's just a light-hearted joke, but it lets them know that we are a non-profit organisation and we can't really afford to have a lavish spread for them, and so the water is always referred to as champagne in our meetings. Who should start the meeting? That's a big thing. Most people ask, should it be the President? Should it be the Sergeant at Arms? Here's my view. My view is that the President should never reside over chaos. And by that I mean people are milling around, organising themselves. It's far better when the Sergeant at Arms taps the gavel and calls the meeting to order. Turns the gavel around, hands that to the President and says, Mr. President or Madam President, the meeting is to order. And so you don't say much other than that. You don't greet the guests, you don't talk, you just simply call the meeting to order and then hand it on for the formalities to the President. And I think what this does is that it tightens up the process right at the beginning, and it reminds guests that they're in a proper structured meeting. The other thing is that the meeting may run late for some reason, tube delays, etc. You may find that you need to extend the meeting, and again this falls to the Sergeant at Arms. His role or her role is then to call a recess. And what do I mean by that? I mean, again, the gavel is used at exactly the time the meeting would have started. You bang on the desk and you say, I'm calling a recess for 10 minutes. The meeting will convene in 10 minutes' time. And this again is impressive because what it means is that you're letting people know that you're aware that the meeting is going to start late and that you have made a plan. And here's another top tip. If the general evaluator is there, they cannot mark you down for starting the meeting late, because you will have done due process and followed the proper protocol to allow for the meeting to begin at a later time. The other thing that you can do that makes it a bit fun and light-hearted, because you know Toastmasters meeting should not be a very rigid and formal, structured event, is you can get yourself a funky receptacle, something like this, something bright and cheerful, because when it comes to vote time, the Sergeant-at-Arms is responsible for sending this round the meeting to collect the votes. Now, some people use a boring receptacle, but you want to use something funky, some fabulous design, something that evokes a beach type scene, and I think that just livens the voting process up somewhat. And the other thing is, when you are a speaker as well as the Sergeant-at-Arms, you will have a conflict of interest. And what do I mean by this? If you are speaking and people might vote for you, then you cannot count the votes, because that would be tantamount to vote rigging. And in that case, the Sergeant-at-Arms would have a helper beside them, and the helper would count the votes, so that there would be no question of one perhaps skewing things in their direction. So be careful. If you're a speaker, you should not count the votes. The SAA is also someone who can be a bouncer. Just like in a nightclub, an unruly person is dealt with very, very efficiently by the Sergeant-at-Arms, and by that I mean somebody misbehaves in the meeting, you might call them aside and very quietly and efficiently restore good order. So our role is not to let the President deal with anything unpleasant, but to deal with it from the Sergeant-at-Arms position. It's required finally that after a successful and delightful meeting that you clear away everything. Your role is to make sure the equipment, the banners and everything else is cleared away efficiently and effectively, so that the next meeting begins with a clean slate. So I would urge you to really explore the Sergeant-at-Arms role. Always have someone beside you who's learning, so that if you can't make it for a particular meeting, you have plenty of people to call on, because you're constantly training your own replacement. And if you are Sergeant-at-Arms this year, I salute you.